So friends, in the first part of the discussion, Dr. Bajaj has laid bare the temper and the discipline of the period, if I can use that word. And the journey of this poet starts in the second decade of the 20th century. When he is a child, he is growing up, in an atmosphere of tensions, pressures, and the pressures are really devastating and violent. And but he is able to, as Dr. Bajaj pointed out, he is able to preserve his personality, his personal content, personal approach, and he through that he understood the a movement of the period, the incidents that happened. And all of us know that Stephen Spender lived in times of the two wars and great violence and upheavals. And violence is negative, as we know, but there is something positive also that has emerged in the 20th century, particularly around the end of the First World War, when Soviet Russia comes into being, and that starts inspiring a whole generation of the 1930s in England. So in the second part of the lecture, Dr. Bajaj would be discussing specifically a few pieces by Stephen Spender, and let's see how we respond to that particular point. So it's over to you again, Dr. Bajaj.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Since you mentioned the the influence of Soviet Russia on the writers in 1930s, I thought I'll pick up a poem which is actually closer in that vein and is closer to that theme. And it's actually titled, it's a famous poem, but you'll find that it's not very easily available online. I don't know, we should find the reasons why. But the poem is titled Not Palaces, An Era's Crown, right? And it is from his first collection of poems, not the first actually, the first was 20 poems, the second one, poems 1933. And in this poem, he's referring to the task of writers at hand. And I quote, and we'll have a discussion on this quote, but look at the quote first. It says, and I quote, "Leave your gardens, your singing feasts, your dreams of suns circling before our sun, of heaven after our world. Instead, watch images of flashing glass that strike the outward sense, the polished will, flag of our purpose which the wind engraves. No spirits seek here rest, but this, no one shall hunger, man shall spend equally," unquote. What do you think? How would you react to this poem?
It's a new idea, definitely, and the 20th century has this distinctive approach to reality and to history, that there will be no inequality. And there will be peace, and there will be stability, and there will be mutual faith, and things that are personal and impersonal at the same time. So it's really appealing, this kind of poem.
In the sense that he's also appealing to people to leave your gardens and your singing feasts. It's no time to be singing, have singing feasts in your gardens, and asking again, I think it's also a kind of a note to fellow writers and fellow intellectuals. So, he believed in the intellectual life also and the role that intellectuals could play. He's not referring to the workers in the industry. He's addressing here those who seem to be leading a life of wastrels, or those who have now become parasitic, because the old world is already giving way to a new world, and decolonization is already in the process of unfolding itself. So as an imperialist country, or as part of this process that is going on, I think Spender realizes that the time for a kind of an order where hierarchies could be maintained, or where the rich and poor divide could continue to exist, now it is at a point where that needs to be questioned. So I think the fact that he's addressed this poem to people who are upper middle class people, because he's asking them to leave your gardens and your singing feasts. They are the ones who have feasts and gardens and parties, and he's asking them to leave them. He is also asking this middle class to not think about personal dreams. He says, your dreams of suns circling before our sun. So leave your dreams before our sun. Before, not your son, but our son.
I'm also struck by the two words, yours and ours.
Right.
He's not saying mine.
Exactly, right. So, he's talking about a kind of a mutual, or a kind of a social dream, you could call it. So, it is your dream as against our son. Your dream of suns circling before our sun, right?
And he has joined the circle of the ours.
Right.
He is not calling them this and that. He is saying yours and ours.
Right, right. So the your dreams of suns in plural circling before our sun in singular. So there is a larger goal that he's looking at, not your personal ambitions that and of heaven after our world, right? So again hitting out also at Christianity in many ways, you know, of heaven after our world, that, you know, leave ideas of those kinds because and focus on this world. You know, don't focus on the world of the heaven after our world, focus on this world. Instead, he says, watch images of flashing glass. Now, you see the kind of, he's trying to yoke in many way two very different categories, but now from sun and other things, he's talking about glass, you know, the flashing glass, etc. So, the images of the industrial town or of war images are present there that strike the outward sense and the polished will. He says, flag of our purpose, which the wind engraves, no spirit here rest, but the one which is no one shall hunger. So he is making a statement in poetry. Even when I said he's lyrical and all of that, he's still using statements in poetry to convey an idea. So his poetry is not without ideas. It's not just an idea of, it's not just passionate lyrical poetry without idea. So I think he's also clear on the statement that he wants to put forth, which is no one shall hunger, man shall spend equally. You know, and this is it's a kind of a statement that he's putting out there. A lot of people have mentioned that, you know, Spender again, like Auden, you know, tried to distance himself with certain poems, and he said that, you know, he doesn't think like that anymore, and that it was his period of the 1930s where he felt like that. Nonetheless, these are important poems and they somehow speak to the following generations, and they have been included in volumes several times. He's not put them out, even though he may not agree with them fully, he says, in a later life, but in that moment when it is written, it spoke to a lot of people, and I think that says a lot about the 1930s in itself. And the title of the poem itself, it's called Not Palaces and Era's Crown. Right, that an era is not defined by palaces. It's not the era's crown is not palaces. It is the fight, and it is this that man shall spend equally and no one shall hunger. So I think he couldn't have been clearer in poetry. Even when he says that poetry doesn't tell you the truth, I think this kind of a poem, this variety of his poem actually pins it down to the very basic issue or the basic theme that he wants to talk about.
But he also is using what is called economy of words. He is making a statement, but not a very elaborate statement.
Right.
He makes it and then he means it and he conveys it as a very important aspect of truth.
Right. So in a way it is epigrammatic. I agree that no one shall hunger, and he leaves it at that and goes further. So I think yes, that is one variety of poems that Spender has written. The other one that I wanted to discuss was Darkness and Light. Now this is an interesting poem in the reign of the dialectical sort of method that I spoke about in his poetry, and the kind of dialectics that emerges in the title itself, Darkness and Light. Now this poem was written around the 1935, but it is there in his 1939 collection in the Still Center, and this is also the poem that he used as an epigraph for his autobiography World Within World. So clearly he thought that this in a way defined his autobiography also in 1951. So the movement here is from darkness to light, and the desire of the poet to, you know, to break the chaos of his darkness. Note how he talks about it, and I'll just quote from the poem itself. And the poem, to quote from the poem, to break out of the chaos of my darkness into a lucid day is all my will. My words, like eyes in night, stare to reach a center for their light, and my acts thrown to distant places by impatient violence, yet locked together to mold a path out of my darkness into a lucid day. So you can see the movement, as I said, that the movement is from darkness to light, and there is the desire of the poet to then break the chaos of this darkness and move out of it, right?
Actually, what draws notice here in this poem is that he's choosing his words very carefully.
Right.
You know, nobody would say day is lucid or day is complex. We will just say that it's a bright day, sunshine, and all those things. But this person is using lucid in a poetic sense.
Right.
So his poetry is poetry. It is totally, even though it's a poetry of statement, as you call it, but it's also a poetry that you know, evokes images.
Right.
And lucidity, you know, means something more. You become outgoing, you relate with the world, you feel happy when you look at this world, and it's a world of equality.
Yeah. You see, the point is that if I were to put these different categories and I'd say that, you know, what are the different kinds of poems that Spender has written, there is one variety which is very statement oriented, as I said. There is another which is very image centric, you know. There is this third variety that I'm discussing right now, which is a very intellectual poem, because he's talking about the mind of a subject as it reacts to situations, and how the mind is constantly in a state of dialectical movement, right? The dynamic of the movement of the mind itself. And I think for that reason, I'd like to put this as a kind of, it's a well edited poem also. As you said, it's a properly done up poem, and this poem has a sense of the mind which is evolving, which is moving in different directions. So therefore I call this variety of poems in that way intellectual. You know, this is also written in you know, and is a part of the collection of the 1939 collection, as opposed to the 1933 collection when he was all fire and blaze, you know, and making statements in poetry. So this particular session, which you mentioned very rightly, the lucid day, I think he's also looking at the phenomena of life from two particular angles. That darkness has chaos, but it also has potential in that sense. The day is lucid, everything is clear, right? Everything, clarity. This is, I think, also the creative process to some extent, where he's talking about the mind which wants to break out of chaos, of darkness, where everything is mysterious, you don't know where your writing is going, into a day which he says is lucid, where everything becomes clarity. It is also the movement of, I think, thought process itself, you know, how you come to a conclusion, how you build on a hypothesis, and how you build and reach a conclusion. So I think it's that way to do with the mind, where it's chaotic and leading to a sense of lucidity, you know. And the day for him is lucid, and therefore he brings the category of the word. He says, my words like eyes in night, right? So my words are like eyes in night, they can't see anything.
Nobody
my words
put
don't
them
make
together,
sense.
eyes and night.
Right. So eyes in night, you can't see anything, right? So my words are blind in that sense. I'm using words, but they don't seem to make sense. They're still a part of chaos, and he's desperate to move out of this chaos and give them a sense of shape, form, clarity. And I think therefore it's a poem on poetry itself, if you could call it, or on the intellectual mind of the poet. So looking for a center for their light, right? And this is how he goes to, he wants to move out of my darkness into a lucid day. So, and yet the following stanza does just the opposite here, and which is why I said it is the dialectic which approaches here, because the poet now wants to retreat to his darkness and preserve it and take it away from too bright a light and too clear a day. And I quote here, yet equally to avoid that lucid day and to preserve my darkness is all my will.
Why does he preserve his darkness?
Yes, because he thinks that is precious, that when the moment it goes too much into the light, and the moment it is too lucid and too clear, it has lost its meaning.
And he's entering the region of the soul, where things you know, are in the process of becoming,
right.
And when they come out, then he'll express them.
Right, and
but
once they are
crystallized,
crystallized, once they are crystallized out there in the open, he wants to avoid it. He says, yet equally to avoid that lucid day and to preserve my darkness is all my will.
So darkness is positive as light.
As light, yes. So, and as important to the poet as light. So it's not like it's not a one-way movement from darkness to light. In fact, when he is in the light, he prefers the darkness, and he says, I want to flinch away from it. And he says, my words like eyes, again words and eyes have come back. Earlier he said, my words are like eyes in the night, so they couldn't see anything. But now he says, my words like eyes that flinch from light, refuse. Now there are the words, when they are too much in the light, they flinch from it. They refuse to make any sense, and they shut upon obscurity. So the idea the poet wishes to bring here is to break out of the darkness, but then to when he's too much in the light, he feels that it is too much, it is as blinding as darkness is. If you can't see in the dark, then the too much of light is also blinding and he can't see anything over there. And then he goes on to add in the next stanza, to break out of my darkness towards the center illumines my own weaknesses when I fail. Again, as I said, he's self-critical, he's looking inward, he's able to look at his failings as well, you know, that I'm unable to strike that chord, that point where I'm not too much in the dark and not too much in the light, because both extremes the poet would like to steer clear of.
So, even though he is surrounded by positivity, he doesn't want to become complacent. He wants to further question himself. Maybe he is wrong. Maybe he's made a wrong choice.
No, also answers are dead ends.
Yes.
So he says, the moment I've reached an answer, I have stopped growing. And I've closed that point. And he says that, so I need to retreat to the dark to find and check and recheck and find maybe another answer.
So answers are wrong. And
questions are right.
Questions are right, yes.
So I think we should not give any answers here. And we should probably put more questions.
Put more questions, read more poems, and look at him in his variety of perceptions and all those things. And here is a poet, who just thinks like us. Us means the readers,
right.
Who have light, who have areas of darkness, and who have to ask questions about both.
Right. So I think he's all for finding a kind of a center, but then he says that when I try to do that, it illumines to me, it reveals to me my own failings. And he says the iron arc of the avoiding journey curves back upon my weakness at the end. So whether the faint light spark against my face or in the dark my sight hide from my sight, center and circumference are both my weakness. O strange identity of my will and weakness. Now he's trying to give it some kind of a form that center and circumference are both my weakness. What do you think?
Well, definitely, because if you have a center, then you become certainly fixed on that center, and you start looking at the whole thing from the point of the center. But
right.
he is questioning also the presence of the center and its importance.
Right. And he says the circumference is, but they are both my weakness. He's talking about the circumference.
Which means weakness also could mean something positive,
Desired.
or desire,
yes,
positive again.
Right.
That he has to go to the circumference because circumference is the masses and center is the authority and the power.
So he realizes that going to the center, when he reaches the center, he wants to go to the circumference, and when he's at the circumference, he wants to come to the center. So there is a constant movement, and he says they're both my weakness, and that he defines it as my strange identity. He says, oh, strange identity of my will and weakness.
So which means you are using the idea of dialectics quite consciously.
Yes, I think he's trying to problematize the whole idea of the thought process that goes on in one's mind and how one can define it. It is this contradiction within the poet that comes alive through paradoxical assertions. And finally he says, terrible wave white with the seething word, terrible flight through the revolving darkness. So terrible wave white and terrible flight through revolving darkness. So both of these, the white and the black, the light and the dark, they are equally terrible for him. And he says, dreaded light that hunts my profile, dreaded night covering me in fears. So there is a sense that the poet is ill at ease in either sphere, and he is not able to and maybe that is what is celebratory about it, the fact that he doesn't fit in any paradigm. This is also because he was ever questioning his own stance and politics also. I'd say that, when if the moment he found something very rigid, he moved out of it. So this constant fluctuations of the mind of the individual and not sticking to any any particular point is a part of Stephen Spender's larger, I think, sensibility.
Did he intellectually accept the reality that you called associated with the industrialism?
I think he was trying to define industrialization like Wordsworth earlier did in terms that are not very happy, I'd say. So, you know, there is this screaming, there is this kind of industrialization which is bombarding lives and which has caused devastations among people. So, I think there is a kind of, there is no love for industrialization in that sense, I'd say. As a poet, he is trying to reconcile the different spheres of his life and the chaos that is created by the circumstances, and in which industrialization and this kind of unprecedented sort of capital gains or growth has led to destruction of life around him.
Which means a kind of industrialization that is sustained by the market, by the commercial forces. That is not his world.
Right.
He is against it, and he wants industry in order only to serve the interests of the common masses.
Right.
So, to that extent it is correct, but after beyond that it is not correct at all.
Right.
So, in a way he becomes critical of the developments that you know envelop the society of the time.
Right, that is true. And yes, that is certainly there, that, you know, there is a sense of inwardness in him, and I think that makes him also critique this and he is in that sense in the 1930s a socialist poet, but beyond it, when he moves around, he becomes more poetic and more inward, I think, over a period of time. He still remains very anti-conservative groups and anti-right. So I think till the end of his life, what described him was more what he definitely could not align with than with what he could pin himself to. He knew where he did not belong for sure, even if he did not know where he could actually find his own center.
Did he come back to himself then, his personal self? Because towards the end you say something
he is throughout. You know, it's in that sense quite Yeatsian, because you know, from the social more to the individual's experience, I think. So how the surroundings work on individual experience and how they impinge on the life of the individual, I think that is something that he tries to capture, then the outward phenomena and how the poet reacts to it. So there is maturity and there is a kind of dilemma, dialectic, all of that is there, which is a part of life. So I think he is more true to poetry you know, in the following decades in that sense, and projects you know, the phenomena from that point of view.
Because what you say is reflected, you know, in his poetry at the time when the Second World War has ended, when a new kind of dialectic, a new kind of dilemma has been exposed, you know, to be real. For instance, the world of the 1950s is entirely different from the world of the 1930s and later, 60s, 70s, 80s when he is alive. Then he is full of doubts and all those things, and he becomes to that extent, you know, somewhat confused, if not confused, at least, you know, unclear about the way the world is moving in a certain direction.
I think we attribute, or we give a lot of importance to where the poet is going. I think we tend to go into the idea of the growth of the poet as if it should lead to something which is greater than what has already passed. But I think in each poet's life there is a decade where he shines bright and he flashes, and for Spender it was the 1930s. I still think the best kind of poems he's written is in the 1930s, because that's where he is more exploratory and has less answers than questions, and is I would say he's a firebrand, not like Auden, not as assertive. He still has a very softer side, a kind of a romantic side to him. So yeah, definitely I think so. I think that it is erroneous to really look for a kind of a growth in the later life of a poet, and I think it is also to do with the decade that necessitated him to write a particular kind of poetry, because in the 50s and 60s, when socialism has taken a different turn, he also became critical of certain practices during
and
the
rightly
period.
I believe.
Yes, rightly. When he you know, he wrote a book which is called The God That Failed Us. So in that sense, he was also becoming self-conscious of the kind of choices he had made. But I think I prefer his poetry of the 1930s, because that's where he is able to, and I mean, why is it that the poet has to write better when he is 50? You know, what is it with that sense of maturity that we seem to accord a lot of importance to the later life of the poet. I think that it is, and that probably has to do with the decade that he was a part of, which also proves a point that one is constantly a product of what one is witness to, and maybe Stephen Spender cannot write that kind of poetry in the 60s and 70s, the kind of poetry that he could in the 30s. So that would be my answer to this question.
So friends, Dr. Bajaj reaches the point where Auden becomes more exploratory, to use our word, and then he somehow is not able to connect that with the reality that he saw in the 1930s. So and since the problem is real, therefore the poet is thinking more and more about it and is making fewer statements. So you can see that, yes, as right, I agree with you, Dr. Bajaj, that there is no journey of the kind that we generally expect from a writer, but then whatever he sees, he is able to register it in his own poetry, and that's where he succeeds, where many others of the time would have failed. Yes. So I think it's a discussion that takes us from light to certain areas which are full of questions, and those questions have to be answered by other poets in the 60s and 70s, and he will perceive, he will observe all that is happening, but in a voice that is not as emphatic as it was in the previous period. Thank you.